Hello everyone, this is Deepak, and in today's video we'll be understanding the most beautiful and the most renowned definition of poetry, and it is, you must have heard, actually, whenever you have come across any literature, then you must have heard the definition of Wordsworth. And definition to Wordsworth, one of the great romantics, he defines poetry in his own way, in his own manner. And what is the definition which is given by William Wordsworth? The definition says poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. Try to understand. This is not just definition of poetry, rather this definition created total stir in the field of literature in 19th century, as this definition get published in the volume of Wordsworth's poetry. To this definition, poetry is nothing but the spontaneous overflow. What? A spontaneous overflow of feelings, emotions that come automatically, it comes spontaneously. It is not something that is created by the pressure of something, or which is created by under pressure of someone, right? If your feelings, if your intention, if your emotions is coming spontaneously, it is coming automatically, it means you are a genuine poet. And this is where William Wordsworth opines that poetry is a spontaneous overflow. It comes spontaneously and it is overflow of powerful feelings and emotions. Very important. Two terms you always remember whenever you come across a definition of poetry, or whenever you come across such things. So feelings and emotions play dominant role. It plays vital role whenever you talk about writing good poetry. In absence of these two basic requirement, poetry seems to be irrelevant. It seems to be barren land, right? So it is nothing but the overflow of powerful feelings and emotions, which is recollected, which is stored in tranquility. So according to William Wordsworth, what is tranquility? Tranquility is a place which is there at the place of heart in human beings. So in our hearts, in human hearts, it is said that feelings and emotions are recollected. It is totally stored, and whenever it gets outlet, it comes through tears, through our naked eyes, and we find that we are sentimental, someone is emotional, right? So this definition reminds us of great romantics like St. Coleridge, where it is P.V. Shelley or John Keats or any other romantics. Almost all the romantics have opined the same things. But why I am talking about William Wordsworth? Because he is the one who is known as the elder romantics. He is the one who propounded, who established the very theory called feelings, emotions in the poetry, and this is why he is sometimes called the pioneer of literature. Pioneer of literature means particularly 19th century literature, right? So we understand one of the definitions which is given by William Wordsworth. Now let's understand, what are the major elements? What are the major elements that a poetry must have? In absence of those elements, in absence of those ingredients, poetry seems to be, poetry seems to be irrelevant. So if I ask you, okay, name five basic ingredients that makes poetry possible, that enables the poet to write something called poetry. So let's understand 5 basic requirements or ingredients that a poetry must have. What are these 5 basic ingredients? First, a good poetry must have beautiful language. This is the first and the foremost criteria that a poetry has to fulfill. Otherwise, poetry will become prose, or it would become something else, but it would not become poetry. So this is first criteria that a poetry must fulfill. So poetry must have Beautiful language. So when I talk about beautiful language, you know very well that in absence of poetic devices or figure of speeches, in language seems to be rough, seems to be uncivilized or uncouth. So in order to make language more cultured, in order to make language more civilized, more beautiful, we use many figures of speeches which are there almost in all the languages. In English too, there are many figures of speeches. For example, simile, metaphor, personification, pun, orthodox, onomatopoeia, and there are several figures of speeches that we use in order to make our language more dynamic, more alive, and more attractive. Right. So the first thing that a poetry must have is it must have beautiful language. And whenever we talk about beautiful language in literature, it simply means usage of poetic devices, right? Usage of poetic device means making the language beautiful, making the language attractive, right? The second ingredient that a poetry must have is imagination, right? Imagination. In absence of imagination, poetry is no more poetry. So it is imagination that gives wings to poetry. It is imagination that gives wings to poet too. It is said that in absence of imagination, poetry would become scientific exploration or scientific research and nothing else. So when we are concentrated towards writing poetry, it is very important. We must not forget to use imagination. Imaginative skill must be there in poetry. Otherwise, poetry would become just a scientific research paper, and that's all. That talks only to our logical reasoning, and that's all. Right? What makes poetry different? What makes poetry different from any other research paper or any scientific? So the first thing is that it's illogicality. Something that is illogical, something which is irrational. Scientific knowledge is rational, scientific knowledge is supposed to be logical, but poetry is not supposed to be logical, it is totally illogical. Something which is illogical talks to our heart, and something which is logical talks to human brain. So poetry is not supposed to be written which is supposed to talk to our brain. In order to talk to our brain, there are much scientific exploration, much scientific things have been explored, and those things talk to our brain. That's enough. But poetry is something that talks to our heart. It appeals to human feelings, it appeals to human heart, and this is why, for this sake, poetry is written. Right? This is the second criteria. This is the second ingredient that a poetry must have. The third ingredient a poetry must have is, fancy. Fancy is one of the things that poetry must have. In absence of fancy, poetry is also how poetry doesn't have any utility in modern life. Right? Fourth thing, when we talk about poetry must have is, poetry must have is illogical reasoning. When we talk about reasoning or when we talk about mathematics, we simply mean something that talks to our brain, that appeals to our human brains. No, it is okay. It is good to some extent, but there is something called illogical reasoning which is there in poetry. Poetry is nothing but illogical reasoning that talks to our heart, right? And the fifth and the most important ingredient a poetry must have, I am giving every one of you time, please guess what may be the fifth good ingredient that a poetry must have. Can you think? Okay, if you are not able to guess, let me tell you the fifth most important quality that a poetry must have is, a poetry must have sensibility, or it must have sensitive appeal. So sensitivity is something that a poetry must bear. So when we talk about sensitivity, what do you mean by sensitivity? Sensitivity means a state of mind where you are able to understand others' feelings, others' emotions, right? In your own way, in your own perspective. For example, if you are going through some problems in your life, and just leave this example, if you are going by road and suddenly you find a widow is weeping alongside the road, many people are just passing and they are not paying any attention to that widow, but you, the one who stopped there and paid attention and tried to figure out what is the problem that the widow is going through. The moment you stop there, it shows that you are sensitive enough, you are sensible enough to talk to that widow, to understand the pain and the problems of the widow. And this is where sensitivity is born. So sensitivity is the fifth ingredient that a poetry must have. Right? So far we understood these five basic ingredient a poetry must have, and if you are writing good poetry, must have these five ingredients. Otherwise, your poetry would become totally scientific exploration. It would become scientific research, not a poetry anymore, right? So in the upcoming videos, we'll be coming up with new things, new topics. For today, it's enough. Thank you very much. Thank you.